Dear guests, welcome to the 11th seminar of our series, Historians and the War, Rethinking the Future, titled Empires and Nation-States of the Past, Present and Future, the Russo-Ukrainian War and Debates in Decolonizing Eastern European Studies. First, a technical announcement. The seminar today will last 2 hours. In the end, there's going to be a questions and answers section, where questions from the audience will be discussed. So, if you have questions for our panelists, please write them down to the chat during the seminar. They will be read at the end. This seminar, as all the seminars before it, is being recorded and will be later published on the YouTube channel of the German-Ukrainian Historians Commission. I will post the link to the channel and our partner institutions into the chat after the announcement. The languages of the webinar series are English and Ukrainian. We have a simultaneous translation. If you want to hear the translation, please click on the icon with the globe on the right bottom of the screen. Thank you for your patience. Now I pass the word on to Natalia Ochanenko-Friesen.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and our special greetings to those connecting with us from Ukraine. We are in almost the end of the 8 months of the war, which Russian Federation has launched an independent and sovereign Ukraine on February 24th of this year. And today in particular, we're connecting in especially dire circumstances because so many of our colleagues are experiencing challenges and difficulties from the most recent attack, which had resulted in the severe shortages of electricity, severe shortages in network coverage, and therefore maybe you're not even with us because of this particular development. As I've mentioned, this war is already in its about to start its 9 months, and we have been thinking over the important questions altogether, all 5 organizations which have launched this seminar, on how we as historians, as social scientists, as humanities scholars can breach the topic of what to do with the world history, with European history, in the light of this ongoing assault on the sovereign Ukraine. Therefore, in May, we have launched the first series in this seminar titled Historians and the War, and it is exactly our job now to rethink and respond to this undoing of history by Russian Federation. And the current war requires us to indeed approach numerous questions concerning how to conceive, how to discuss, how to look at the history of this continent, I mean Europe, of the world altogether, the history of relationships which we have been living through in the last 30 years of post-Soviet history, what to do with memory of the horrific events of the 20th century, how to move forward. So these are the questions we all have been addressing throughout the seminar, and today's seminar continues on this discussion. Let me briefly introduce the 5 partners who are behind this wonderful, wonderful initiative. The German-Ukrainian Historians Commission, represented by the co-chairs of the commission, new chairs, Dr. Gerasimov and Dr. Guido Hausmann. I hope you are with us in the room, Professor Hausmann. And the Department of Eastern European History at Munich University, represented by Dr. Martin Schulze Wessel, who is presenting in today's seminar. Dr. Yaroslav Hrytsak of Ukrainian Catholic University is moderating this event today, but also a co-founder of the seminar. Ukraine-based scholarly journal Ukraina Moderna is represented by Dr. Gerasimov, who is also coordinating the series and is a founding member of the series. And finally, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, which is represented by myself and Dr. Frank Sissin. This is our 11th seminar, and we are very pleased to have established and phenomenal scholars and experts in the topic we will be addressing today. Let me briefly introduce our speakers. The seminar is going to be moderated by Dr. Yaroslav Hrytsak, who we know as eminent historian of Ukraine, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor of Ukrainian Catholic University, also the Director of the Institute of Historical Studies of Ivan Franko National University of Lviv. We also know Dr. Hrytsak as a long-term serving co-chair of the German-Ukrainian Historians Commission. I'm going to present our speakers in no particular order. Dr. Ilya Gerasimov, who is also well known amongst scholars and historians, the chief editor of Ab Imperia, for example, is this probably the platform which allows us to also reflect back on his contributions to the field via that very vibrant series of publications. Dr. Gerasimov holds a PhD in history from Rutgers University. He is an executive editor of International Quarterly Ab Imperia, as I've mentioned, he served as a director for Center for the Study of Nationalism and Empire. His record of publications is always large, and I believe, Georgi, you are sending the links to our participants in the seminar or other guests so they can read more about the accomplishments of Dr. Gerasimov. Dr. Martin Schulze Wessel, also former co-chair of the commission, is our next speaker today. Dr. Wessel is known as the German's leading scholar in Eastern European history and Slavic literature, is based in Munich currently, and also was a member of other academic communities back in Moscow and also in Berlin. He had written his PhD thesis on about the Polish question on the Russia-Prussian relations in the 18th century and 19th century. And we know Dr. Wessel, Schulze Wessel, sorry, as an active contributing member of many debates on the current global crisis triggered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Please, again, Georgi, throw a link to the full bio so our guests will be able to follow the other accomplishments. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Botakoz Kassymbekova, who is currently, I understand, serving as a lecturer assistant professor in modern history, and with the specialization in Soviet history, Stalinism, post-Stalinism, Russian imperial history. And again, the link will give us further information, but Dr. Kassymbekova comes with a PhD from the Humboldt Universitat of Berlin. She holds MA from the University of Essex and BA from the American University of Central Asia. She's published on various topics, and her recent book is Despite Culture's Early Soviet Rule in Tajikistan, has come out in Pittsburgh University Press in 2016. But I also know that all the presenters gathered today have been featured and contributed to the very special issue which Ilya, you have launched early in 2022, focusing on imperial and post-imperial developments in our field in relationship to the ongoing war. So I'm very pleased to introduce you all, and I'm happy to pass on the torch now to Dr. Hrytsak, who will lead the seminar. Before I'll do so, let me just briefly remind the way we will be working today. Each speaker will have up to 15 minutes of introductory statement, and then Professor Hrytsak will take over and will hold the discussion for another half hour or so with our participants following questions. And then the general Q&A, questions and answers, will be turned open for all in the room. Thank you very much. Professor Hrytsak.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I have a real privilege to open this kind of our discussions. Without further ado, I would invite our speakers to make their presentations. And if I may ask Botakoz to take the floor. Botakoz, if you please. Botakoz, sorry.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Hello, everyone. I would like to start, I would like to speak today and present on a presentation on Soviet colonialism, because I think that there were several debates, or many debates about whether the Soviet Union was colonial or not. And I think we still did not solve this issue. And I think talking about decolonization, we also need to talk about what kind of colonialism was there for us to have the understanding what is at stake. However, later during our discussion, I also can contribute with practical suggestions on how we can decolonize our field. But I do think that it is very important for us to understand the current Russia's aggression war against Ukraine to really tackle the question of Soviet colonialism. So one of the I think one of the problems in our field was the understanding of Soviet modernity as modernity, the use of the term of modernity, but I think also wrong, misleading comparisons of the Soviet empire with overseas extractive colonialism. So I've been working with a colleague and a friend of mine, Aminat Chokabayeva, on developing a new model and concept of Soviet colonialism. And we think that the concept of settler colonialism really helps us to explain many of the things that took place during the Soviet times and that are also taking place right now. So Aminat Chokabayeva and I argue that the Soviet practices and strategies of incorporating territories of the former Tsarist empire are best understood through the logic of settler colonialism, and we base kind of our model of Soviet settler colonialism on the kind of model developed by Patrick Wolfe, an Australian historian. So what is settler colonialism? The key principle of settler colonialism is territorial acquisition through the elimination of the natives and the dissolution of the native body politic. The elimination of indigenous societies may take violent or coercive and involve assimilation as well as ethnic cleansing and forced displacement. While forced removal and decimation of the native population frees the land for permanent settlement, the dissolution of indigenous institutions and their co-optation and eventual assimilation facilitate cultural erasure. The uprooting of the natives is accompanied with the rooting of the settlers. Settler colonialism produces the feeling of permanency of the settler colonial order. The settler colonialism thus cannot be reduced to a single event of conquest. It is a structure that must eliminate the indigenous claims to sovereignty. And this basic kind of logic of settler colonialism, which is elimination as a structure, differs from overseas exploitative colonialism in two major respects. First of all, overseas extractive colonialism is interested in extracting labor rather than territory for settlement. Since the main goal is labor exploitation, the logic of extractive colonialism is aimed at legitimizing the subjugation of enslaved labor by establishing strictly enforced racial division and segregation. On the contrary, the settler colonial order does not seek to extract labor for it is the land that settlers desire. The original owners of the land must be assimilated into the settler society through intermarriage or linguistic and cultural assimilation, so that nothing and no one stands in the way of colonial settlement. Furthermore, assimilation can be rewarded with social mobility of select native elites and sold as multiculturalism at the same time as most natives are dispossessed and marginalized. The Bolshevik sovereignty was based on the conquest, control, and integration of the territories and peoples of the former Tsarist Empire through continued settlement of borderlands with Russian colonists and assimilation of the native peoples into the Soviet project via state-sponsored campaigns targeting indigenous elites, cultures, and institutions. At the same time, the Bolshevik regime also accommodated principles of overseas extractive colonial practices and employed industrial and mass bureaucratic technologies of governance. The uprooting and dispossession of the native societies and their replacement with Russian colonists was not novel or specific to the Bolshevik regime. In critical ways, the Soviet authorities intensified and broadened the policies adopted by the Tsarist government, which saw settlement of borderlands with Russian colonists as key to securing and integrating the newly annexed territories into the empire. So as an example, in the late 19th century, Russian military academy statisticians, colonial statisticians designed maps in which the maps showed territories where there were more than 50% of Russian population. They were officially designated as reliable territories. Territories where there were less than 50% of the Russian population were officially designed as not reliable territories. These maps were used to train colonial officers. At the same time, if we look at year 1989, more than a century later, the last Communist Party leader used the same logic to explain the use of force against the protesters in the Baltics. And so I'm quoting Gorbachev, who was explaining, we have 60 million living out there in nationality areas. 50% of Estonia are Russians. Over 50% of Latvians are now Russian. In Ukraine, 50 million are non-Ukrainian. Kazakhs are only 30% of the population. Our country is that way, and separatism brings out strong feeling by the people. Although Gorbachev's numbers were not entirely correct, the logic of settler colonialism was obvious. Not only did Soviet Russia have to restrain the I'm quoting here, destructive forces in the Baltics and the Caucasus, national republics were merely nationality areas in the majority or near majority Russian population. The settlement of non-Russian peripheries with Russian colonies was a crucial element of Soviet settler colonialism. We distinguish four types of Soviet settler colonialism: first, penal settler colonialism, mobilizational, volunteer, peasant, and professional urban. I will not give details to that model. At the same time as settlers were funneled into national republics and regions, their native populations were dispossessed. The strategies of dispossession included the forced removal, such as deportation of enemy nationalities, as well as the forced sedentarization of nomadic communities to make way for agricultural colonization. But Soviet colonization was not only agricultural, but also industrial. Since land was state-owned, colonization did not involve acquisition of big land estates by the privileged settlers, but the most the most privileged settlers were industrial workers. Collectivization is the most obvious example of extractive colonialism, but it also facilitated the settlement of Soviet peripheries. While the primary goal of collectivization was the permanent expropriation of land and produce from peasants, it also functioned to create pools of reserve labor that could be used for future projects of colonization. The introduction of the passport system stripped peasants of mobility, placing them under state supervision and control. The model that we develop of Soviet settler colonialism, I will not give all the details now, but I'd like to focus now on the question of race, space, and status. Hierarchical racialization is an organizing principle of settler colonial governance. It allows both assimilation and exclusion. The settling and the construction of Russianness as a higher racial category were mutually constitutive. Indeed, Russianness has become the expression of higher status, and the new Soviet person was portrayed as a Russian person. Russian language became a universal mandatory language of schooling, and intermarriage with Russians for the purposes of Russification was advocated by the Soviet state since the mid-1930s. Assimilation into the dominant status group allowed cultural erasure of non-Russian groups, but it also could increase the settler population. Assimilation was used to eliminate indigenous claims to sovereignty. It is a form of elimination through cultural erasure. Rather than an expression of fraternity and equality in the settler colonial context, it aims to make natives surrender cultural, social, and political autonomy. Although overt racial assimilation was never elevated to a comprehensive state-sponsored campaign, Sovietization implied the adoption of Russian language and lifestyle built on Russian models. In the Soviet case, national informed socialist in essence was a formula of assimilation, which was based on the premise of retaining differences while fostering indigenous uprooting. I'm sorry. National informed approach is often understood as a Soviet dedication to anti-imperial multinationality. However, the formation of new national republics and districts did not lend any meaningful political sovereignty to the new created polities, nor did it prevent the dismantling of indigenous institutions of power. Rather, fostering selectively defined groups' involvement within the state policies was a tool of assimilation in the Soviet regime. Since Russianness was a racialized status category through which settler colonial governance was organized, it was not automatically granted nor available to everyone. Race as a hierarchical organizing principle was at the core of the settler colonial logic in the Soviet Union. As Eric Weiss argued, the Russian people and culture were seen as manifestations of primordial being and the model for other nationalities. One's ethnic belonging was registered in personal official documents, which then influenced one's status in the hierarchy of Soviet citizenship. Governance through differentiation was flexible, and one could, to a certain extent, change one's status category. Russification, learning Russian language or marrying a Russian considerably increased one's chances of climbing the status ladder. Such categories were spatialized. Since urban places were political and cultural nodes of settler colonialism, they were also spaces of Russification. Urban status Russified a non-Russian vis-a-vis kin's rural dwellers. The urban status was more likely to facilitate that process. Cities were privileged territories that were permanently policed through registrations. Living in the city secured privileges that were not shared with rural peasants. Cities were primary spaces for settlement of Russian settlers through the Soviet Empire. The process of Russification was uneven for Slavic and non-Slavic groups. Theoretically, a deported Ukrainian, or rather his or her children, could acquire Russian settler status if undergone the process of assimilation and cultural erasure in the city. The settler status would be confirmed with his or her ability to move as a Russian settler to non-Russian regions. Hence, a second generation Russified Pole, for example, whose parents were deported to Central Asia, could move in the 1960s to Estonia via education acquisition in Moscow, Leningrad, or Novosibirsk. A Tajik had less opportunities for moving to cities and hence Russification, but even in that case, the possibility of him to become a Russified settler in Tallinn were much lower, if inexistent. And I'll just add a couple of notes, if I may. I was just meeting yesterday with a scholar who's studying closed cities in Kazakhstan, and she's an anthropologist, and she just said that she came from field work and said when she talked to a person who comes from a closed, Russified closed town, that was closed during the Soviet times, when he went to visit a neighboring village in Kazakhstan, and that was recently, he said, "Oh, I visited Central Asia." A person who grew up in Central Asia, who grew up in this closed settler town, closed town. And that is kind of the way kind of the settler society and settler mechanism and also identity works. But also, I would like to finish with a note. I've recently listened to a podcast on, the current war in Ukraine, and a historian, Andrei Zorin, was arguing that what is happening right now is not imperialism, but nationalism, because Ukrainians are not seen as others, whereas Chechens are allowed to be seen as others, and that's why we can call kind of war on against Chechens as a colonial war. We cannot. We need to understand that this is a nationalist war, and I think what is at work is really a different model of colonialism. And I think by really understanding the Soviet colonialism as settler colonialism, we will have different kinds of debates and understanding, because settler colonialism is the one that involves kind of this cultural assimilation, Russification. We will understand more the policies right now of, stealing children, of genocide, of resettlements, but also we will have better tools to understand what we can do about it. How can we decolonize, not only, of course, politically, but also culturally and socially. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Botakoz, and I'm turning the floor to Ilya. Ilya, if you please.
Thank you, Yaroslav. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel on the topic that for the past 23 years has been central for the journal of Imperial that I represent as its executive editor. And of course, you know what this title means, right? From Empire. So we've been engaged with the problem of decolonization for the duration of this century and a year or two in the 20th century, in dialogue with national historians and post-colonial theorists. I will just briefly summarize the rich body of scholarship accumulated in the field of new imperial history, following the logic suggested by the panel's title, which is very informative. So, empires and nations. 25 years ago, Ron Sunyi suggested that empire and nation were the two opposing ideal models, and as such as ideal models, they're of course incompatible. Unfortunately, this witty structuralist interpretation doesn't really stand to scrutiny. Empirically, we know that nations and nationalism were developed within imperial formations that coexisted with them, sometimes perfectly coexisted, and tried to put them in the service of empire. Think of modern nation states such as Turkey or Israel that are accused of imperial policies, foreign and domestic, or think of the ideal nation state of all times, the French Third Republic, that was also a major empire. Think about the phenomenon of nationalizing empire, such as late imperial Russia, that were the most oppressive polities. The imperial regime embraced Russian nationalism, populated and for several decades since the second half of the 19th century, strived to convert the country into a Russian nation state populated by ethnic minorities and as second-tier citizens. Or think about the Third Reich, which was not just national but racially homogeneous, yet perfectly imperial. So we don't see this incompatibility empirically. But even more importantly, Sunyi's model is methodologically flawed. As was demonstrated by subaltern studies back in the 90s, national movements that established nation states on the ruins of empires embraced the old imperial structures of hegemony. As we can observe today, most colleagues confuse anti-colonial with post-colonial. Nation state is anti-colonial, but in terms of its control of discursive and political hegemony, in terms of respecting political and human rights, it could be even more repressive than a multicultural imperial regime. So there is no clear opposition of nation and empire here. I mean, politically, people are free to call any oppression and domination colonial, but analytically, I see little added value in this indiscriminative application of the term. It makes sense to conceptualize nation and empire as predicates rather than subjects. So speaking not about nation and empire, but instead of imperial and national forms of social imagination, for example, particularly when it comes to social difference and diversity. To an imperial worldview, an irregular diversity is norm, not out of liberalism, multiculturalism, or respect for human rights, but because that was a social reality for most of human history. Irregular diversity is about operating with several autonomous principles of groupness simultaneously and ascribing political status to their combination rather than to some pure forms. Were ethnic Russians the inherent folk in the Russian Empire, for example, the serfs? Were the nobility the ruling class in the Russian Empire, for example, the Polish nobles? Were Muslims second-class subjects, given that Bashkirs had more nobles per capita than any other ethnic confessional group? How to classify rational believers? in the central provinces or in exile in the Caucasus, where they acted as agents of empire, despite their legal stigma. Oppression, discrimination, and resistance were real in empire. But it is virtually impossible to identify these relationships with stable social groups for any lasting period of time. And that's why it's an analytical problem rather than just a political one. It would be just very easy just to blame oppression and solidarize with groups that oppose them, if such clear-cut groups really existed. National episteme perceives any irregularity as a scandal. Of course, it recognizes diversity, but only in a two-dimensional matrix. So an ethnicity can be compared only to another ethnicity. So a Ukrainian or German means the same in any part of the country, or should mean the same in any part of the country, regardless of social status or economic status. A confession is only about religion and not about citizenship and legal status, as it was the case in the Russian Empire. National episteme is a recent phenomenon that emerged by the end of the 18th century, and it is a necessary prerequisite for a modern mass society of near universal literacy, ruled not by tradition and communal self-organization, but by universally applicable and impersonal institutions run by professional bureaucrats. Nation is a horizontal community of solidarity of the people who can never meet in person and are brought together by agreeing that they all share some general markers of commonality for the sake of achieving some common political goals. This sense of commonality and common goals is communicated by mass media because people can never talk to each other, to all members of the group. So a national society should be literate and mobilized culturally and politically, and modern in this sense. Whether it is based on a common ethnicity, on class, on race, religion, on ideology, on territory, is of secondary importance. We know historical examples of nations built on one or combination of these factors. The position between primordialists and constructivists is equally relevant because any modern nation is a very recent product, as Yaroslav underscored in his recent book. And key to its existence is people's conscious participation in a nation. In the past, empires aspired to turn into nation states or clashed with nation states over the principles of conceptualizing and personalizing diversity. The ideal scenario was, of course, to transform into a federation. So in 1917, Britain converted into a commonwealth, while the Habsburg Empire, that was a model of a multinational federation, lost the war and collapsed. The Soviet Union was a complex polity with contradictory policies that was outlined many years ago by Peter Blitzstein, demonstrating how imperial tendencies coexisted with the opposite anti-imperial and decolonizing trends. So it can be discussed in simple categories, although any models of critical deconstructions are very important to discuss the Soviet past, of course, and are relevant and applicable. But the Soviet Union was in many ways implemented the Habsburg project as a federation of territorial nations. Because ideologically, programmatically, Bolsheviks had nothing to say about the polity that they all of a sudden built in 1922. So from the past moving to the present, we observe a failure of the nation state. We may laugh all we want at Russia's corruption and how the formerly illegal private military company Wagner has more political influence and economic resources than Russia's Ministry of Defense. In general, what we observe is the strategic conflation of the private and public spheres that have been so persistently separated in modernity, which is the definition of corruption in modern state, of course. But think about the recent record of handling COVID in Western Europe or in the United States, where the state has been unable to organize the production of face masks and hand sanitizers, not to produce thousands of tanks and airplanes as in the 40s, or impose mandatory vaccination. I'm speaking particularly of the United States, the beacon of modernity. Compare this to German and American war effort in the 40s, to sanitary practices of the mid-20th century. Can you imagine nowadays putting a Western city into quarantine, which was perfectly okay, say in the 70s, in the Soviet Union? Think about the deep state conspiracy theory, about Trump's administration's policies, but also about the calls to defund the police, or the meager state of European armies nowadays that just virtually non-existent, and really, if not for Ukrainian war effort, would be in real danger of Russia's aggression. Consider the rise of neo-populist political movements. Politics and money, private and public spheres are increasingly coalescing because of the erosion of the state as an insulation between them. And this is happening because of the increasing erosion of nation as the foundation of modern society, due to economic and cultural globalization, but also to the evolution of the human rights concept. And here we come to the future in the topic of our panel. Almost 25 years ago, Jürgen Habermas published his seminal essay, The Postnational Constellation and the Future of Democracy. Since then, a formidable literature on postnational condition has emerged. Initially, it was mostly about the effect of globalization, and Habermas thought that an improved EU can serve as an example of a postnational arrangement. What became clear only recently is that the modern state functions only as a nation state. As soon as it becomes possible to question national unanimity, say regarding vaccination or participation in a war, the state begins to collapse. The existing model of the state implies the universal belief in its legitimacy and Foucauldian self-discipline as the main instrument of sustaining social order. Cultural and general pluralism, new forms of horizontal solidarity via Facebook and Twitter undermine the state. Postnational condition is the future, just as nation was the social norm in the mid-20th century. You can ignore this reality, of course, dislike it, think how, or either ignore it or think how to minimize its dangerous effects that manifested themselves in Russia, including the aggression against Ukraine. And this is why new imperial history is so central for contemplating the future. No, of course, we don't need new editions of empires, those archaic and repressive political formations. But human brain cannot produce something completely inconceivable and unprecedented. The only form of national and or a national society known to us were historical imperial formations. So studying them allows to, critically of course, studying them allows to identify forms and practices that can be reinvented for a democratic and inclusive society. Russia's aggression against Ukraine resulted from the culmination of Russia's nationalization, as the country, for the first time in history, finally turned into a nation state. Its genocidal policies in Ukraine, its full-scale racist public discourse that Botakoz mentioned, and fantasies of viruses and insects that target only one human species and not the other human species. Its rhetoric points to the nationalist political project. Ukrainians shouldn't be subjugated politically, as was the program of various Russian imperial formation or Soviet imperial formation. They should be turned into Russians, literally, not even just Russified, or should be annihilated. It's a complicated topic, and I don't have time to discuss this, but in short, this is exactly what modern sociological model predicts of a polity facing the post-national condition, the rise of new ultranationalism, only without the existing nation. And war, as was the case with the Third Reich or World War I, is the mechanism to nationalize the country, lacking a homogeneous mobilized nation. It is necessary to mobilize nation, which is a sine qua non for an really effective nation state. In a desperate attempt to revive the normal modern nation state, part of Russian political class resort to ultranationalism. And in this respect, as in 1917, Russia is representative of an emerging global trend. And it's better to learn its lesson in order to avoid its fate. Many prefer to speak instead of Russian centuries-long imperialism, as those present at this panel, which is understandable, but, and I don't want to discuss its politics. I'm not in a position to discuss the political aspect of this argument. But academically, it is unsustainable and politically suicidal in the long run. Look at what happened to the Russian society that embraced the idea that Nazism is a German Sonderweg, which can never happen to anyone else, particularly to those who had defeated it in war. It's a sweet illusion that leads to a catastrophe. Please keep this in mind while decolonizing East European studies. Are you fighting the structures of hegemony or just Russia? And the key question, what's Russian? I mean, is it Ruski or Российский? Is it Russisch or Russlandisch? Without this basic distinction and analytical effort, any discussions are just politicking. They have little intellectual added value. Over the past century, the nation state was the main structure of hegemony, sustaining exclusivist narratives of national history. If you want to take Russia's place and put the structures of hegemony in your service, prepare to share Russia's fate in some not very distant future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilya. And now our final presenter, Professor Martin Schulze. Martin, if I may ask you to start your presentation.
Thank you, Yaroslav, and hello to all. Thank you very much for having me, and hello especially to the audience in Ukraine. I think we have heard, we have listened to excellent presentations, and I'm still thinking about what Botakoz and Ilya told us. Maybe we should think also about a Russian Sonderweg, a special path Russia took since the 18th century, I think. I think this, with regard to the German history, the idea of a German Sonderweg, which is much criticized in Germany, that it is not entirely wrong. There are specific preconditions for National Socialism in German history. And of course, there's no determinism which leads from the 19th century to National Socialism in the 1930s and 40s. But one has to think about the path dependencies in imperial histories. Well, one can discuss colonialism in this very fruitful way Botakoz did. She described settler colonialism as a narrow concept, I would call it, that is an analytical concept. And there are other concepts which are much broader and maybe have less value for the explanation or for analysis. But we have to deal with these broad concepts as well, which are about cultural hegemony. And in the last days, there was a discussion, a debate in Germany when one German novelist, a very good novelist, Eugen Ruge, when he criticized the Ukrainian novelist Oksana Sabushko for her criticism of the Russian culture, of Russian literature. She had a speech in which she, and an article afterwards in Neue Zürcher Zeitung, in which she criticized, for example, Joseph Brodsky or Dostoevsky, and found colonial patterns in Dostoevsky, for example. And Eugen Roth characterized this as cancel culture, as blaming the whole Russian literature. But I think, and others did so too, there was a debate after this that it's of course normal, not only with regard to Russian literature, but also with regard, for example, to English literature, to criticize, to deconstruct colonial patterns in literature. There's nothing holy in literature, and there's nothing what cannot be criticized. Well, this leads me to a question, are there maybe biases in our discussions about the nation and the empire? And I think there are biases. Of course, this does not mean a degradation of empire research. On the contrary, we have need in empire research as it is done and represented in the journal Ab Imperio, for example. Well, I would like to illustrate this bias with help of two quotations that formulate the position of historical scholarship on empire and on nation in an exemplary manner. William Thunderbird has written about the relationship to empire in the journal Ab Imperio in the first issue of this year. And I quote, "The history of empire is diverse and intricate. To study the subject well, the subject of empire, our approaches have to be just as complicated, as intricate." I think everybody could agree to this. And Jörg Babrowski has a similar pointed reflection on the nation. He wrote, not in Ab Imperio, but elsewhere, "Nations are either victors or victims. They need enemies in order to be what the nationalists have imagined them to be. Historians, however, refute the myth. They are the nationalists' worst enemies. They ask questions and want to know how it actually has been, wie es wirklich gewesen ist. According to Sunderland, we have to do justice to the empire with its great complexity, with our heuristics. We have to be as complicated with our heuristics as the empire is. And the nation, on the other hand, we study not by adapting our heuristics to it, but by critically deconstructing it. As historians, we consider ourselves, as Jörg Babrowski puts it, as natural opponents of the nation. These core statements, the core statements of these two sentences each seem to me to express mainstream in historical research or in scholarship. Even if the sentences are pointed, hardly anyone would disagree with them in principle. They express widely accepted views about the nature of empire and the nature of a nation. But less plausibility would be generated by reversing the two statements, although, of course, empires are also based on myths, and nation states are also complex, especially if they have federal structures and especially if they are integrated into supranational structures. Taking the two quoted sentences together, the problematic bias in our optics emerges, which describes different degrees of dignity and truthfulness to the orders of empire and nation. For research, this can have far-reaching effects, and this can be demonstrated by the example of Ukrainian history, and Yaroslav Hrytsak has made this point. Also in the last issue of Ab Imperio, that the history of the Maidan in the 2010 stands in a worldwide series of revolutions and protest movements. In historical considerations, however, it is associated with great regularity, above all with the Bandera cult, and thus removed from global references and singularized. Although the historical critique of nationalist myths is crucial, it is at the same time very problematic because it ignores the broader political agenda nations have. What was at stake in 2014 was nothing less than the creation of a democratic nation. The nation is to be understood not only in terms of its myth production, but also as a form of self-organized based civil society. If one wants to do justice to the complex history of the nation, one could say with William Thunderbird, one must choose approaches that are informed by the diversity of the forms and the functions of the nation and of nationalism. And this would also open up an approach to Ukrainian history.
Thank you so much, Martin. We have 3 presentations, and actually I wouldn't go in our conceptualization, because basically we are talking about the current state art. And I would start our discussion with the major question. And this is the question that since beginning of the war, there are more and more voices heard that demand decolonization of European history. In your opinion, is decolonization the correct term? If yes, what do you mean by it? If not, what do you suggest instead? But of course, may I ask you to start to answer this question?
Yes, thank you. I do think that decolonization is a correct term. Simply, as you heard, I analyze the Soviet experience as a settler colonial experience, and that has not been worked on, but also because the structures in academia are also colonial and post-colonial. So for us, I mean, it was it would be a very interesting research how settler colonial academic structures have developed, and of course because erasing different nations and polities and cultures is the major principle of settler colonialism. It of course affected the way knowledge production has worked, and knowledge was preserved or not preserved. Because if elimination kind of is the logic, we are confronted with a myriad of problems of how to write about those who were erased. I mean, and how to, like, for example, genocides are, and physical extermination and deportation is a key universal logic of settler colonialism. For us to look at the concept of genocide is crucial and key, and without the concept of settler colonialism, we will not be able to deal with that conceptually, but also legally. And what do we do about it? But at the same time, if we look at academic structures, because Russification and racial hierarchy was a key, also structural modus of securing that colonial empire. That's why, of course, centralization and metropolization was key for that. One of the ways for us to deconstruct, I think, our field, and I think this is a key issue, something that I wrote for the Up Imperia opinion piece, is that all the, I strongly believe in that all the federal archives that are now in Moscow must be, the copies must be transferred to each republic, so that we don't travel to Moscow to study our history. But this will have profound implications for the epistemic production, because if a scholar can choose between going to Moscow or Tbilisi or Bishkek to study the Soviet past, and can access, this person will be more exposed to other places and other visions and other, positionalities, and, because structurally everything goes through Moscow, and archives and how archives are being stored only.
Botakoz, if I may, I believe we'll be tackling this question further on, how to decolonize. But let's just focus on the concept. So you think this is quite correct concept, decolonization?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know we have exchange of opinions before this discussion. We discussed it with Guido Hausmann. I believe Guido Hausmann, the opposite opinion. I will probably ask him to share his opinion afterwards. But before that, I'll turn to Ilya, and I believe it's kind of a waste of time because we know your position. Your position stated by the title of your journal, Abimperio, it's quite clear. But still, decolonization as a term. Could you comment on it, Ilya?
Very briefly. One can be surprised that 31 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we still discuss the decolonization, but then think about the Soviet period when Soviets for 70 years complained about the damn Tsarist past. And if people feel themselves in the colonial situation, this is true. This is right. And I'm not in a position to question this terminological choice. I believe that we need to do critical epistemological deconstruction work. And there could be different names for this. If decolonization, if what you need, then of course, this is a useful concept and it can be productively applied. The difference is that it's a more, my vision is more general, as you can imagine, because critical epistemological work is like in practical terms in this archival relocation project that Botakoz mentioned. We need to make archives available. If they're copied, then they're digitized. If they're digitized, they can be put online, and they should be available to everyone. That's the difference. Not only they should be located to, selectively. A document mentioned Kazakhstan and Ukraine. We tear the page apart. One page goes to Astana, and another goes to Kyiv. I suggest that it should be equally, because I'm old-fashioned. I believe in human.
No, you're not old-fashioned. But again, if I may, let's talk about the how to decolonize later on. Let's focus on the concept so far, if I may. What I suggest.
So my take on decolonization is critical epistemological work. We deconstruct hegemonic narratives and models, and that's how we undermine structures of hegemony, and given a voice to the silent minority has been a historical task in modern historiography since the annals schools, in the work of medievalists, since the great micro-historians of the 70s. It's still, I see it's a more general and more inclusive task.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Martin, what is your take on that issue?
Well, with regard to the archives, I would like to add that though Czechoslovakia was not an empire, but when it split up, the archives were divided between the Czechs and the Slovaks, and this might serve as a model. And with regard to colonialism, I would agree that it is a useful concept, the broader one and the more analytical one of settler colonialism as well. And I think that this imperial turn has to be rethought in favor of colonialism. There have been excellent research, excellent studies about the modernization effects of empires and the integration effects of empire. But empires do have another side, do have another dimension which can be analyzed maybe by the concept of colonialism.
Thank you so much, Martin. Again, could I ask Guido, just to remind you that Guido is now new co-speaker of our German-Ukrainian Commission, and Guido's just sent me a letter text said to the fact that they had discussion like this in the day Leipzig community, and they have some community. Could you some conclusion? Could you share it with us, Guido, if you please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Yaroslav, to have me. Yes, there was, for instance, an informal meeting of 3 Leibniz institutes in Germany, which do research on Eastern Europe. We had an exchange of views on decolonization, which could mean in German Dekolonisierung oder Dekolonialisierung, so which is a bit different. Well, my point is a bit that I see it as more as a binary concept. So here's a colonizer, and he, on the other side, the colonized. There's little room for gray zones. There's one setter which is acting, which is a political subject, and the other side are the colonialized. They have no agency. So I think it is a bit too simple if we have it as this, which does not mean that that there was no colonialism and no colonial empires, but I think that notions as hegemonic models or decentering are probably better for research agenda. So these are my points on this.
Thank you so much, Guido. If I add something to this discussion, I have to say that we Ukrainian historians has a problem with using the term colonization, colonies, decolonization, in the sense of Ukraine, the case of Ukraine, because it's very hard to say whether Ukraine was colony or not. Probably the proper question, to what extent Ukraine was a colony, to what extent it was not. Because in many sense, Ukraine's case is both similar to Scotch case and to Irish. Ukraine has been both Scots and Irish of this empire. They're also empire builders and empire destroyers, so to say. And therefore, this probably makes this kind of Ukraine case that interesting, also very complicated. Also, this is one of the probably issue that this Russian-Ukrainian war tries to resolve, in a sense, this kind of systematic, so to say. So this is something which I want to bring to our discussion as well, because we're having this problem, Ukrainian historians, both as historians, but also as citizens of Ukraine, because it affects them in many ways. But again, the question was from Polina Barvinska. We already partially touched this question, but if we decolonize this study, what we should do? Botakoz started with the idea that displacing the archives, so to say. What else? Is there anything that would suggest, Botakoz? If I may ask you, Botakoz.
Yes. So on other practical issues, I mean, we have, I think we need a major conference, something like ACES, located in one of the places of Eastern Europe or Central Asia. It could be a moving conference, but it should be a big one. We have different smaller conferences, but we need a major conference, and probably something that would take place every second year. So 1 year the conference takes place in the United States, and one in one of the places in Eastern or Central Europe, because I think for practical reasons, for historians or scholars of Central Asia or of the region, it's very expensive to go to the United States, where a lot of interesting discussions also on decolonization are taking place, where the whole kind of global community of scholars meets. So we need to diversify and become more we need to integrate a wider audience, and I think we need to work on that issue, to include more voices, also to include more voices not only in at conferences, but also in publications, in teaching, in positions. We also need to think about that. How do we diversify? At the same time, the way settler colonialism works, because it doesn't divide racially. It's not the settler colonial logic doesn't make the other. It's not imperial rule through othering the others. It's not the same as othering, like British colonial rule in India. So a lot of assimilation that is taking place is part of that, what Chingiz Aytmatov called kind of, assimilation into the dominant narrative. So inviting, for example, a Kazakh or Tajik doesn't mean that decoloniality is taking place, because a lot of the people are assimilated into that kind of narrative. So what we do need, of course, we need diverse voices and diverse people with different positionalities and experiences, because we don't know. We need to look at many different issues that historians did not touch upon at all. But I think we really need to have these discussions about, what kind of colonialism took place, for us to understand positionalities, because positionalities that are coined in settler colonial kind of context differ. For example, just one point: affirmative action is a tool of settler colonialism, and it's kind of a universal tool of settler colonial, because it's integration of certain people into the dominant discourse. So we should not, I think, go into that fallacy again of affirmative action, because it's a tool of settler colonialism. We really need to look at how we do diversify the field, but we do that in a way I don't have an answer. To not only to privilege kind of the privileged voices already in different communities, but create a dialogue with voices that we have difficulties hearing. Yes, sorry, it's not very. I don't think I have a. Yes.
Thank you. It was an excellent presentation. Natalia just sent us information, short info, Natalia Khnenko-Fizov, that the next topic of the AC's conference is that decolonization. As I said, that we Ukrainian historians feel not quite comfortable with this concept of decolonization. I want to turn your attention that Andrei Zernyuk wrote an excellent article in East-West journal, and basically this is article how to a certain extent those who deal with Russian history and the Soviet history, and critically, they enabled this Russian aggression against Ukraine, and basically and he suggests probably as a more correct term, the imperialization, which I again don't see this kind of how it works, because given this kind of the idea that Ilya brought, that there's not quite dichotomy between a colony and empire. Ilya, I probably have a more specific question to you, because I was following your discussion at the very beginning of the war discussion. Then you probably blamed or claimed that some of the historians tried to normalize Russian Soviet history. Then in a sense, they're responsible for this kind of the Russian aggressions against Ukraine. Could you elaborate it, if you please, and probably tell something about this discussion? And correct me if I provided this wrong.
Thank you for the question. It's an important question. We're all haunted by the question: what did we personally, as individuals, as professionals, did or did not enough to prevent this war happening? Especially Russian scholars and intellectuals in general, and clearly. We have not done enough, even in this authoritarian, or as some call it, totalitarian regime. But the problem is exactly the lack of critical epistemological work that was more sustained in imperial studies, because I can't imagine of any professional historical study of the pre-17 period that would glorify Russian Empire territorial conquests, I mean, and just speak about nice life on a gentry state. With Soviet period is more complicated because so many people has come to Soviet studies, and as Yaroslav mentioned, there's a disproportionately now investment into recently modern period of history, certainly post-World War, Soviet and post-World War, and so many scholars have this additional political agenda when they come to Soviet studies, and through Soviet studies, they perform their own decolonizing, or used to perform decolonizing work. For example, fighting American hegemony or global capitalism, identifying with Soviets and via Soviets poking the big Satan in Washington and whatnot. And that's fine. I mean, we all have our political loyalties, and the problem is that we need to differentiate and somehow keep them aside from our professional work. And this is not what happened in the Soviet field. On to the contrary, a good Soviet historian is expected to be an activist, to glorify the Third International, to glorify Soviet war effort. And totally, and specifically, this is what struck me. It was back in 2014 that I realized that Ukraine and Russian aggression against Ukraine presented this unbelievable laboratory for modern historians, that we can understand things that we couldn't understand for example, how it's difficult to actually start the war. Historians believe that you get the order, you attack the enemy, and the First World War, World War II started. But 2014 showed how it's difficult for Ukrainians was to start actually killing, to start murdering. It's only when your friends, when are killed, when it becomes personal, then this logic of personal involvement in warfare and bloodshed unfolds. Same with revolutionary revolutions. It's no longer an abstraction. We observed in real time what a complex and controversial thing this is, and the same with and war. We can understand World War II much better, the German side, the Soviet side, because of this war. And when we see that Russians today, Russian army does nothing new that was done in the 40s, not only by Russians, but say to some degree by the allies, but this is their responsibility. I can speak only as a Russian citizen, as Soviet. It's important that Ukrainians are as post-Soviet as Russians. So speaking about historical, the past dependency and the influence of history, I mean, Ukrainians were among the Soviet troops that pillaged the Polish and German populations and did all these horrific war crimes because they did it to their own, to Soviet citizens. I couldn't understand what, but the effect is different. Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian state demonstrate a very different warfare, culture of war, ethos of warfare than Russians. Russians are doing what they've been doing in the 40s, consciously reproducing the Soviet war effort with all this indiscriminate bombing, attacking infrastructure, just because we don't have modern history of how Kharkiv was shelled, not by Wehrmacht, by Soviet army twice, and nobody cared about civilians hiding and because that was the culture of the Stalinist Soviet Union. And modern Russians are just reproducing this. And this was my argument. Ukrainians, even despite these historical debates, and Yaroslav was so pivotal too, and he knows that they were not as probably they were not as effective in their not effectively affecting Ukrainian society as one would wish. but there were these debates about Ukrainian role in the Volhynia massacre, in the Holocaust, but still in the Holocaust. There were such discussions in the Russian Federation in the 90s, but for the whole generation, for the past 20 plus years under Putin in particular, this is a taboo topic. There was glorification of everything Soviet, and unfortunately, for ideological reasons, this is of course a taboo topic for German scholars, and but even to Americans, you just cannot discuss the ambivalence of Soviet role in the war, of the genocidal and racial policies of the Soviets in the war, because it's politically impossible. I understand that. I understand how important this clear political stance for the entire Bundesrepublik political project, and that you just open a Pandora box when you actually and you will be accused of being an ultra sympathizer and dismantling the entire historical strata. I understand this, but this is the effect. This is what contributed directly to this barbaric war that Russians unleashed onto Ukraine. And this explains why a segment of Russian society, we don't know, we can't know how much a significant segment of Russian society somehow identifies with it, because people are invested not in anti-Ukrainian policies that much, but into their own past, because they have to be completely, to deconstruct and reject all the Soviet history. And it's not like 30 years as for Baltics people. It's 3 generations. All the people that they knew, they're like in my case, all the family members who fought in the war, were killed. And this is personal. And to do this, but without this critical analytical work, epistemological work, without this critical historiography that raises the simple question, and what the Soviets were doing between September 1st, 39 and June 22nd, 41, what was their role in the war? What was their treatment of their own civilians? And then, of course, of German and other civilians. Was it not a war crime? Without these questions, you can't be surprised what's going on nowadays in Ukraine. And this shows that the Soviet past is not a sentence that, court sentence that determines your fate for the future. Ukrainians had the same past. Part of them, particularly in Western Ukraine, participated in anti-Soviet guerrilla uprising, but the majority was the Soviets and participated in these things that the Soviets did. But they have done this critical work on the past, while Russians did not, and you see the direct results. And historians who are, empire, yes, it's important to deconstruct Russian empire, to criticize Russian empire. Nobody glorifies Russian empire, come on. But those who are, they're not part of really respectable profession. It's different with Soviet past. And how to walk a thin line between this totalitarian school, just wholesale condemnation of lives of people who tried to live decent lives under the circumstances when they didn't have very often much choice. And on the other hand, this wholesale whitewashing everything that they did in the name of progressive ideals, right? This requires a tremendous intellectual effort and courage and taking responsibility. An intellectual effort is more difficult than taking responsibility, because Germans showed how you take responsibility even for the things as we understand it now. As a Soviet, I'm sorry I'm taking this much time, but this is what we're all thinking about. As post-Soviets, as people of my generation, we questioned in the 70s and the 80s, why Germans obeyed Hitler? Why did they follow this criminal orders of their commanders. How could they start to unleash war on us, so nice Soviets? Now, from within this Russian modern day situation, it's historical justice that people who believed in being absolutely, this in the saint-like status of victims, now they're on the other side. And we can read this German condition very differently, better than Germans can allow themselves, because to them this is political, to you.
Thank you so much. I'm at
loss.
loss. I'm at loss. I'm at loss because we have a long comments and questions in our chat. And if you start to read these questions, I believe we will be much more time, and time is limited. So I suggest probably I would like to ask our presenters to take time later on and to respond directly to this question and comments in the chat. If I may ask you to take your time. And now coming to Martin, I quite agree with Ilya that there is not any historians who glorify the Russian Empire. But the problem is, I know some historians do that normalize Russian Empire. That say Russian Empire was doing nothing worse than British did, than the French did, in a sense that you nothing to complain with, so to say. You Ukrainians, because basically, if you be Belgians or you'll be Finns, you'll have the same things. This is what we call normalization of this Russian Empire. This is what I mean. This would bother us, because you could hardly imagine somebody doing British history and to normalize British Imperial discourse experience, or doing Ottoman history. And this is not the case with Russian history or the Soviet history. This is what bothers us. It might be mistaken. And this particularly refers to the German case, which is most interesting and probably the most promising case, because yes, indeed, Germans has been, so to say, outstanding work into overcoming the past in the recent. But still, there are certain taboos and probably political taboos. And this is something that we encountered together with Martin. We were co-speakers of our German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. This is the famous case, was ignorance case of the Holodomor as a genocide. It's not the issue whether Holodomor was genocide or not. We'll discuss it. But what was just kind of surprised that there is no German historian nowadays that they could professionally deal with the history of Holodomor, which is kind of strange case, because I believe German history is probably the best in this field nowadays in Europe. And you still have a kind of Italian historians, North American historians who deal with the Holodomor, but unknown in Germany. And since this last 20, 30 years. So this is probably some kind of the Hrytsak paradox. Could you comment on that? Because basically in our understanding, decolonization also means structural changes. Being if you have a chairs in Eastern European studies, there's probably chairs of Russian history rather than Ukraine or Tajikistan history. So this is probably, I'm sorry for such a confusing question, but the way is that. So why we have this kind of the great gaps in the presenting the field Eastern European studies, particularly in Germany?
Maybe just one sentence to your first comments on the German reflection about the 20th century and working on guilt. I mean, there has been done a lot with regard to National Socialism, but very little with regard to German colonialism in the 19th century. I mean, Germany was a colonial empire. There have been atrocities and genocides from German side, which are maybe researched, but which are not discussed publicly in a sufficient way, I would say. And the intriguing question indeed is, why is there no real good book about, or no book about the Holodomor in Germany, although we have quite strong research on Stalinism. So one could even say that in Germany there is research on every aspect of Stalinism besides the Holodomor. And well, I think there are different answers, and it's not easy to answer the question. One point is, I think that the question of the Holodomor, at least till 1989, was quite politicized. When the book of Robert Conquest was translated into German, The subtitle was about the Soviet Bergen-Belsen. And at that time, in the late 80s, there was a consensus following the Historikerstreit not to compare and not to identify the German crimes with Soviet crimes. So therefore, it was difficult. And I mean, there are other reasons which are not accidental, but to a certain degree accidental. Research on Stalinism has been done mostly at the chair of Jörg Barbarowski, and he for him it's not interesting for some reason to do research on the Holodomor and to support young scholars to do it, but everybody could do at every chair, also at my chair. So if there would be interest now by young scholars to do empirical research on the Holodomor, I would certainly support it. But I must admit that it has not been done for many years. Very telling is a book by Susanne Schattenberg now, A History of the Soviet Union, with just very few sentences on the Holodomor. And this book was published only last year, so there's much to be done. I admit this very openly.
But this wouldn't be this kind of the practical step toward decolonization, this appearance of such a study, so to say.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we will have, in our commission, we will publish next year a volume on the Holodomor. It will be the first volume in German on the Holodomor. But this is, of course, it's not sufficient. We do need monographs written for the German public.
Thank you so much, Martin. But of course, I believe you raised the hand. But before, if I may, there is a question particular to you by Alexander Simonov. Before you frame your statement, there is a question to you. Decolonization often thought to be a return to authenticity and indigeneity. But what could be the definition of authenticity and indigeneity these days? This is the question too, if you are able to answer that.
Yes. But first, I would like to also say something about different research topics. And I've been communicating with scholars from Central Europe, from Eastern Europe, from Central Asia in the last months about decolonization quite intensely. And what I heard, a very recurring kind of phrase that I heard from people, from Latvia, from Poland, from Uzbekistan is that, but like if we talk about this issue, we will be claimed as nationalists. And so there is a big fear among non-Russian scholars that we are stigmatized and marginalized and disempowered, and our views are devalued by the fact that I come from Kazakhstan and I didn't study hunger, and I went to study Tajikistan, first of all, because I wanted to learn another language, see another country. But also I knew that if I study Kazakh hunger, people will immediately claim me that I'm a nationalist. And in order to avoid that, I didn't study my own country and the experience of my own family. So we need to address that issue, because this is, I see that in reviews and publications so much, this kind of the stigmatization, and that has to do something with our history. And that's one thing. The second, on Alex, your question, well, I think we need to, I don't know people, scholars from my kind of networks who is going into authenticity. I don't think, I don't simply know these people, but I do think that studying your own language, something that I've recently also started intensely studying Kazakh, is a decolonial act of overcoming shame, because Kazakhnes was constructed as something shameful, as something to be ashamed of, something of a lower culture. And because Kazakhstan is kind of divided, Russified Kazakhs are called Mankurts, and rural Kazakhs who were, in rural areas are called Mambets, which is a racial slur. And Kazakh society is divided between that. It's a kind of a product of Soviet settler colonialism. And for us to become a nation, we need to find a common language and overcome that shame of being Kazakh, shame for our parents. I can tell you many stories of shame. And so we started talking about this shame, and this is empowerment. So decolonization for us and studying Kazakh and speaking Kazakh is a political act, because before, even if you had a Kazakh accent, you would immediately have less chances in your life. It shaped your whole life, So for us, actually, speaking Kazakh and overcoming shame of being Kazakh is an act of empowerment. But I don't know, for me, it's not about, living in a yurt now, but for me, it's about overcoming colonialism and overcoming racial hierarchies and racism that we've experienced. And yeah, it's about our empowerment. And on the question of Richard Smith, I think he wrote, so how do we divide, should we not distinguish Sovietness from Russianness? And I'm currently writing a book, it's called Imperial Innocence, where I explain how Sovietness and Russians were coupled, and Russianness and greatness were coupled. And how do we need what Russia has to decolonize? I mean, we will decolonize ourselves. Kazakhstan or Central Asia, we are in a very kind of, as societies, we discuss this for long now, but I think it is especially important for metropolitan Russians to start the process of decolonization and to decouple the idea of Russianness and greatness, Russianness and Sovietness, because these were constructs, and I argue that it was a Stalinist construct. So you cannot have de-Stalinization without decolonization. I argue that, I believe in that, and I explain in the book how it was the Stalinist idea to couple this, and it has, because we had de-Stalinization focused only on, prisoners, but never focused on the colonial construct that Stalin has created. That's why de-Stalinization did not work, and de-Stalinization would not work without decolonization. Thank you.
Thank you. I will strongly support what you just said, because this is our experience. My personal experience is seen by most of our colleagues, Ukrainian colleagues. Being Ukrainian colleagues, we are quite perceived as being Ukrainian nationalist. There's kind of shame, embarrassment, so to say. But we have recently discussion with Professor Dariusz Stolle from Poland. He made a very interesting comment. Basically, this is now a flipped story, because now it's very embarrassed to be Russian historian nowadays, since beginning of the war. So because now they have to understand, have to explain how they have what is meaning to Russian, how they come to this kind of situation. And this is, I believe, this probably leads me to the final question, which I would like to pose to each of you. We believe, this is not to just believe, this kind of reality, the Ukraine nowadays is a game changer. Ukraine changed a lot, if not everything, including our field, so to say. So this is exactly, I was just talking about some kind of decolonization, depolarization, as a kind of the pragmatical steps to be taken, institutions, book to be published, all the kind of things, or this is something which go probably deeper, if I may borrow from Ilya, this kind of epistemological turn issue, so to say. In a sense, if Ukraine is a game changer, does this Ukrainian war, Russian-Ukrainian war, does it call for some probably change of paradigms, paradigmatical shift in what we're doing East-European studies? But of course, would you start? I see you supporting my thesis. But of course, may I ask you to start answer this question?
Well, absolutely. I absolutely agree. I think the war, but also Ukrainian reaction has been absolutely empowering for marginalized voices and marginalized views, because when I hope so. I hope so. I think there was a question about Soviet nostalgia, but I think this is what was my experience in actually Western scholarship, is that a lot of scholars, a lot of historians were usually telling me at conferences, why you're not grateful to Russians? You know, this was, although I've never talked about Russians, I was talking about the Soviet experience, you know, I've never framed it as, you know, something being Russian. But the idea that the Soviet Union is Russia and Russians is very dominant in Western discourse. And so it didn't matter what I did and what I wrote, the experience was always ungrateful Central Asian. Now everything has changed. So for me, it's now not the question of the field. For me personally, it's not the question of my knowledge or my truth. It's a question of morality. It's a question of our values. And what we do now, we need to understand that what we are changing now, or what we are, this is very important for us to speak up, because it's about democracy, it's about values, it's about our cultures, it's about our autonomy, it's about our dignity. So for me, it's not simply about the field, it's not simply about the histories that people write. They don't affect me anymore. You know, if before I was angry at what people said, now I'm not angry anymore, because I know that what we're doing has a much higher value. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Botakoz. It was excellent. Ilya, may I ask you the same question? Are we dealing with the kind of the epistemological paradigmatical shift, if I may phrase this like this way?
Yeah, I mean the war effect on you mean how
in larger context without that, because Russian-Ukrainian conflict, but particularly war, so to say. This is just issue of decolonization, or just broader issue of the paradigm shift?
I didn't want to speak on this topic before Russia's defeat, and I hope it will be soon. But in purely intellectual, academic context, not political, I have to say that the war, that Putin will lose, Russia will lose, but Putin's goal will prevail in reviving for a long time nation-centered episteme and nation-centered politics. Ukraine as this most dynamic post-Soviet society, most creative post-Soviet society, that demonstrated, as I argued elsewhere in Euromaidan, the first, in my opinion, first truly post-colonial revolution, establishing subjectivity, not conditioned by the other, not fighting for 70 years with Tsarism, with Russians, whoever, are just establishing their subjectivity, which is the only way. It's like an abusive relationship. You are free only if you are over any relationships of blame, of victimhood, the reasons to blame. There was actual victimhood, but to be free, you have to be post, not anti, but post, just indifferent. And this is why Ukraine was, even though this initial Euromaidan impetus was kind of disappearing again because of Russia's this aggression since 2014, but this is what made Ukraine the main danger to any nationalist regime or aspiring to become nationalist, because the post-Soviet condition that drags on for 3 decades and more can be resolved only with the answer to this general predicament that face any established Western democracies, that is post-nation state and post-national. And Ukraine seemingly, instinctively, implicitly, will find a new ways that could show to everyone else. Now we see that good nationalism prevails over bad imperialism. So the natural conclusion is that you should rehabilitate everything nationalist or just nation-centered, because empirically you see that this is the right cause. And that's why, well, when Putin will lose and Russia will lose, their main political goal will prevail. And that's what I'm afraid. And that's why what you and other Ukrainian colleagues are saying about Ukraine becoming European and joining Europe, not in the sense of just joining the Francophone Reich of European Union, but just somehow transcending the beaten path of nation state, just allowing for a more complex arrangement, right? Accommodating Ukraine's diversity that no traditional nation state paradigm can accommodate. That's why this is really a productive answer, not neo-colonial, finding a new hegemon. It's really probably something that worth exploring as a path, but I'm very pessimistic about the effect of the war.
There has been, thank you so much, Ilya. There has been a very interesting article, provocative by Innocenzo. I forgot the first name, which is in Novaya Gazeta 2 days ago, which basically says the only way to recuperate, to normalize Russian society is to de-sovereignize it, at least partially, which means only with incorporation within the structure of European Union, NATO. This is the only way that nowadays you don't agree with that.
That's the problem. That's the problem why I mean, even Ukraine is too big to Europe, and German political elites are so concerned, and you know why.
No, he's not talking about strictly incorporation. He talked that this something has to be done under the dictation, this kind, because otherwise he seems to be that Russian problems go too far, and Russian society has no potential to resolve them. So there has to be some kind of external pressure to put on Russia.
Unfortunately, it's too big for this. I mean, it's too big, and it has to. And the real post-colonial effort for Russia, well, the country most likely will disintegrate. But the real, which is, I mean, there is nowhere written in stone that there should be such polity. But they will remain diverse communities, not nationalized through the nationalizing 20th century. That are individually too small, economically insignificant politically, they will still seek some arrangement, some political arrangement to somehow to cooperate, and I hope that in the future this critical work will be done there, right? And of course, Russia should be Russians, including myself, teaching all of you, should learn humility. And I hope that I'm lecturing only in my capacity as a scholar with some experience and expertise, not only as a Russian who had these grand messianic ideas that they should immediately impose on everyone else.
Thank you. If I may respond immediately, I believe it's a being humble. This is what the history teaches, or offer us, or demands for us to be humble, ours to say. Endeavors, but still we do believe that without our way of talking about history or the kind of things, we could hardly expect some kind of changes in our countries. So actually, I believe historians matter and history matters in a sense. I'm sorry, being probably pathetic, but this is why I believe what we all of us believe is our credo, what we share. Martin, and what would be your take? Are we still doing with this kind of just structural problems, kind of the institutional changes or the kind of things, or are we expecting to have some more deep epistemological paradigm shift in the fields of European studies?
Yeah, well, I think this war will indeed be a critical rupture for Russia, and images play a great role in it. I mean, this idea of Russian greatness and superiority is smashed now by the Ukrainian army. And this has the biggest impact on epistemologies, I think. Well, during the war, we have been rethinking much of Russian history. For example, still before the war, this idea of translation of Russian history from the medieval Kiev to Moscow and then to Petersburg was quite common in Western scholarship. And I think now it's undermined and it will be replaced by other narratives, or there will be at least competition between various narratives. And the same is true for Russian literature. I cannot imagine that Russian literature will be taught the same way it was taught until last year. So the impact is great, and it's I think it's too early to conceive how great this impact will be.
Thank you. I'm at loss again because we have only 10 minutes left and there are so many questions in the chat that I believe we need more time. But I could not but ask Natalia Hanenko-Friesen because Natalia has her own question. Natalia, could you just speak it up, your question? I believe they were important.
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to eavesdrop on this amazing conversation. And I cannot really help myself to voice the understanding of mine that they will continue having different diverse perspectives on what terminology, what lenses we would need to use to look at what we are undoing. This is also a question, what exactly we're going to be undoing. Either just history, going retroactively back in history, that's what Yaroslav was referencing to, or we're adopting useful, helpful methodologies as they are presented to us in different discourses, different fields, which will help us to undo the studies altogether, because history and Eastern European studies are different ones. I am curious whether we will need to have a consensus, or we can just proceed with perspectives as they're framed by our own positionalities. And then what is it that we need to be gaining to achieve in this particular case? That was my question. I think it's maybe too large, but in the essence, do we need to have a one and only word, one and only framework to do what we want to do?
Thank you so much. Botakoz, may I ask you to answer this question?
Well, I think there can never be consensus about anything. So, and there, I think, will be always different interpretations of everything, and that's was always the case, and I think it will be the case, and I think this is very important that we have different groups and different people from with different backgrounds speaking, also because, for example, if we ask our own questions when we go and we study something else. For example, I've noticed that a lot of kind of American scholars who study Central Asia, Soviet Central Asia, for them, very important are the ideas of capitalism. So this is kind of how good was socialism, you know, what social, because for a lot of scholars, they're looking at the American realities and they're kind of dealing with that. And of course, people bring their questions from their societies, from their experiences into the field, and that's wonderful. That's very important, I think, that we have that diversity. I think diversity is a critical point of view. Of course, as a historian who've now been, you know, looking at one model, which I think really works to explain, I will be working with that model in the next years. I'm writing a book on cultural history of Soviet settler colonialism. I'm writing another book on explaining kind of post-Soviet, post-Stalinist experience as well. So what, of course, I will be doing is I'll be explaining why I think my model is useful for us, but I think it is very important that we have this diversity. Yes.
Thank you so much, Botakoz. Ilya, if I may.
Well, in a sense, this is what we discussed at the panel of journal editors that Frank Sisson attended and saved the day in a way. And there should be probably, there of course should be a combination of this nation history perspectives, but also we cannot, I mean, even national history perspectives cannot actually produce much results without being in dialogue with others in some bigger, larger field. That's why the potential of Soviet studies, or Soviet history, was so great, because implicitly, potentially, it was a transnational field. It could be developed in categories of transnational. Instead, de facto, it was monopolized by people who, because of the slippage of the tone in English, but also in Ukrainian, that Russian, as a more political entity, somehow becomes ethnic confessionally, ethnic category, and here we are already, and hence Richard Smith's question was really good, because I mean, this is very important distinction, just as complete blockage of the problem of modernity by Botakoz. There's no modernity. I mean, Soviets is Russians and colonialism. What about modernity that was criticized by people exactly for the same evils, for people starting with Foucault, who were actually were not thinking about the Soviets or Russians or otherwise, what to do with the modern condition that unfortunately is so repressive and can have so many faces. It could have Soviet, it could have anti-Soviet, capitalist or socialist faces, but nobody managed to skip over modernity and have to find their own answer to modernity. And in this about consensus, finding a consensus or disagreement, not only people, the historians, this is our modus operandi, we should find disagreement, because otherwise we're redundant. That's why historians are so unfriendly and literary scholars are so friendly and hugging each other and like each other, because they have different material. We need to identify our unique material and to show how we're different from that. That's why we have so low Hirsch indices, unlike social scientists, for example. But that's just the example of national identity and the trauma of famine of the 30s. It's very illustrative. As national historians, you can claim that in the paradigm of absolute victimhood that's began by Armenians and Jews with the Holocaust, in the same paradigm, Ukrainians refer to Holodomor, completely ignoring and thus devaluing the trauma of Ashar Shalik in Kazakhstan, where up to 25% of Kazakhs died.
No, Ilya, don't say that. Don't
right,
say it.
I will not. I will not,
I'm
because
extremely aware of this kind of comparison. We're doing all the time.
All right.
All the time.
I just read literature. Yeah.
Let me just defend my. Yeah,
no. It's not political accusation. It's just about the optics. If we don't have this common, if there's common some sphere where we discuss our different perspective, we'll ignore the Leningrad siege famine, which I insist had all the preconditions, all the course of a typical Soviet imposed famine. It's convenient to project everything onto Germans. I know this is politically incorrect, but I'm doing analytical work, not political.
No.
So I'm a public intellectual.
That's.
I know it's improper. So I will stop here. I know that you feel uncomfortable, so I will not proceed.
I feel quite comfortable.
But this is
comfortable.
All right. So we find an intellectual, analytical model, and conceptual language that make the discussion of these things appropriate and not shockingly to everyone. This is why we need to sustain our profession as an transnational, not just international, to sustain dialogue. Otherwise, we just prove what we know already. Why a good historian is about finding new answers and identifying new problems and finding something that we didn't know already, something new.
I do agree completely with you. And I compliment in any possible occasions. But let me just correct. If you follow the last discussion, last publications of Ukrainian and Ukrainian scholars on the Holodomor, they do exactly what you just said. Comparing with any kind of famine, including I'm not sure about Leningrad, let me check, but with Kazakhstan, very much so with the Kazakhstan famine, with Chinese famine, with any famine, with Irish famine. They do globally, so to say. They try to globalize the Holodomor because they prove this is what we historians do, basically. Yes, we could blame.
Blurb for Knox volume. I endorse this.
So you could blame Ukrainian historians for many things, and we deserve this kind of accusations.
I don't blame anyone.
No, I'm just saying,
discussing historiography.
I'm saying, but this is, I would say, this is not quite correct. To say that we ignoring Kazakhstan, not Kazakh, definitely. You have to check about Leningrad. I have to ask my colleague, but the comparing with Leningrad studies, but we do that. We are, so to say. I'm sorry, we did take this kind of discussion. Martin, what will be your answer to what Natalia asked?
Well, I would support what Botakoz said. I mean, we, on the one hand, we are international historians, and maybe we meet at a certain level, but there can be a consensus at a certain level. But on the other hand, we address our national audiences, and I think this is especially important now. Botakoz made her point, what her mission is, so to say, and I just want to, or I'm now writing a book to the German audience where I want to analyze the problematic legacies of Russian history since the beginning of the 18th century. And for that reason, for this purpose, I need, methodology of international politics and discourse analysis. And my methodology is just tailored according to this aim, which is in the framework of a national discourse, I would say, because, as you know, in Germany, there are much has to be rethought, say simply. We have to work on these national myths which are different.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, most unfortunately, we are now reached the limits of our time, and I have my personal feeling. It's like I'm being undernourished. It's very, very good supper, and I have to leave the table too early because we just start the process, so to say, the most interesting part. And I would like to suggest that let's continue this discussion further on. Let's talk about that. But most of all, I ask probably Georgi, and probably Georgi first time, could you collect all the questions and comments in the chats and send to all of us, particularly to our participants, so to say. And I would like to ask them to thank them for this discussion. Without them, discussion would hardly happen. So I say, good luck. Let's go on. Let's discuss the things. Let's keep for diversity, but still, let's keep Ukraine in our mind, especially now. And
Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.